There's a passage carved into a painted wall in the Valley of the Kings that Egyptologists translated catalogued, and then quietly set aside. Not because it was damaged, not because it was incomplete, but because what it described, if read literally, rather than liturgically, did not match the story Egypt had told about its most famous queen. For decades, mainstream Egyptology maintained a comfortable silence around the death of Nefertiti. She ruled beside one of history's most controversial pharaohs. She may, for a time, have ruled alone, and then she simply disappeared from record. No mummy confirmed, no tomb named for her, no cause of death etched into stone in the way that tradition demanded. That silence, scholars insisted, was normal. Records were incomplete. Tombs were looted. History had gaps. But what if the silence was not a gap? What if the silence was the answer? To understand what was hidden, you first have to understand what was known, or what we believed we knew. Nefertiti was the great royal wife of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who dismantled Egypt's entire religious infrastructure, erased the traditional gods, and declared that only one divine force was worthy of worship: the Aten, the solar disk. Nefertiti stood beside him, and by many accounts stood in front of him, as the living embodiment of this new theological order. The famous bust, now housed in Berlin, has made her face one of the most recognized in history. But that face, that composed, elevated gaze, was the product of a royal image machine. The actual woman behind it remains, even now, one of archaeology's deepest unresolved questions. Around the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti vanishes from official records. No farewell inscription. No death stele in the conventional sense. No tomb built to her specification in the royal necropolis of Amarna, where the couple had relocated Egypt's capital. The official reading for much of the 20th century was simple. She died, probably of plague, possibly of political erasure, and her burial, like so much from the Amarna period, was destroyed, dismantled, or lost during the violent damnatio memoriae that followed Akhenaten's death. Egypt, in other words, erased her. That was the story. Clean, tragic, tidy, until certain walls began to speak more precisely than anyone expected. The friction began with a scan. In 2015, British Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves published a proposal that sent a controlled shock through academic circles. Based on high-resolution scans of the walls inside Tutankhamun's tomb, the small, oddly shaped tomb known as KV62, Reeves identified what appeared to be sealed doorways hidden beneath centuries of paint. Two passages, invisible to the naked eye, but detectable through the subtle geometry of plaster and pigment. His argument was bold, that KV62 had originally been built not for Tutankhamun, but for Nefertiti, that the young king, who died unexpectedly and without a completed royal tomb, had been buried in the antechamber of a larger, deeper burial complex. That behind the decorated wall of Tutankhamun's burial chamber, another chamber waited, sealed, unentered, intact. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities authorized radar surveys. A Japanese team from Waseda University conducted ground-penetrating scans. Initial results were, to use the clinical language of archaeologists, suggestive. Then a second survey, conducted by a different team with different equipment, was released. The results were less conclusive. Science had produced a conflict, and that conflict, curiously, was handled very quietly. If you want to go deeper into what the ancient texts actually record, and why so much of this never reaches the mainstream, stay with this channel. Most of what the hieroglyphs actually say does not make it into the headlines. But Reeves's architectural argument was only one layer of what the walls contained. Inside KV62, on the northern wall of the burial chamber, there is a painted scene of a ritual known as the opening of the mouth. In this ceremony, traditionally performed by the heir or successor, a priest holds and adds to the face of the deceased to restore the senses, sight, speech, breath, for the journey into the afterlife. The figure performing the ritual in Tutankhamun's tomb is depicted wearing something specific, a kepresh, the blue war crown, associated with living pharaohs, not with priests. Reeves noted that this figure bore the cartouche of Tutankhamun, but that the cartouche showed signs of having been painted over an earlier inscription. The bone structure of the face, when compared to known iconography, was distinctly feminine. This was not a new observation. It had appeared in earlier scholarship and been set aside as an artifact of artistic convention. But convention does not usually paint over a cartouche. Someone changed a name. Now we must sit with what that means. There are 3 ways to read the evidence. The first is the standard academic reading. Tutankhamun's tomb was small and unusual because of the circumstances of his early death. The scene on the north wall follows ritual convention, not literal portraiture. The architectural anomalies detected by radar represent natural variations in plaster, not sealed chambers. And the Nefertiti question, while genuinely unresolved, remains a mystery of lost records, not of hidden rooms. This is a serious reading. It is held by serious people. It should not be dismissed. The second reading is the one Reeves proposed, and which a minority of Egyptologists have found compelling, that Nefertiti's burial lies behind the western or northern wall of KV 62, that the tomb was repurposed after her death to accommodate Tutankhamun, and that what Egypt sealed was not simply a body, but the entire material record of the Amarna theological experiment, everything that the post-Akhenaten administration needed the world to forget. In this reading, the erasure of Nefertiti's name was not accidental. It was a decision. The third reading is the one that neither camp fully engages, that Nefertiti's disappearance from the record was not the result of death, but of transformation, that she continued to rule under the name Neferneferutin, a female pharaoh who appears briefly in the record after Akhenaten, and that when she finally died, the instructions left for her burial were so closely associated with the heretical Aten theology that the Ammonius priesthood, who reasserted power after Akhenaten, could not permit them to stand. That her tomb was not lost. It was buried by intent, not by sand, by a decision made by people who understood exactly what they were doing. This is where the hieroglyphs enter not as decoration, but as evidence. Inside the royal tomb at Amarna, the incomplete complex built for Akhenaten's court, there are painted scenes in the subsidiary chambers that describe death rituals unlike any recorded elsewhere in the royal canon. Scholars have catalogued them. Some have noted their strangeness. Few have published sustained analysis of what the language is actually doing. The standard Egyptian funerary text invokes Osiris, the Lord of the Dead, and the various gods of the Duat, the underworld, as guides and protectors of the deceased. This is the language of the Book of the Dead, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts. It is a language of transition, the soul moving from one state into another, guided by divine mediators. The Amarna tomb texts do not do this. They invoke the Aten directly, the solar disk, the singular god. They describe the deceased not as passing through a divine underworld, but as returning to the source. The language is less transitional and more recursive. Less the soul departs and more the light is gathered back. Egyptologist Jacobus Van Dyck, who has written extensively on the Amarna period, has noted that the theological implications of this shift are profound and still incompletely understood. The Aten theology, at its core, proposed a divine system with no intermediaries, no Osiris, no judgment, no weighing of the heart. In the Amarna framework, the Aten alone governed life and death, and the pharaoh, as the Aten's sole earthly representative, stood in a position that had no precedent in 3,000 years of Egyptian religious thought. What this means for Nefertiti's burial, if a burial exists, is that whoever sealed it would have sealed something that didn't just contain a body. It contained a heresy, and heresies in Egypt were not merely religious offenses. They were existential threats to Ma'at, to cosmic order itself. The place where all of this converges is in the damaged inscription. In one of the subsidiary rooms of the Amarna royal tomb, in a passage that forms part of a larger funerary hymn to the Aten, there is a section where the name of the deceased has been deliberately excised. The plaster was cut, the cartouche removed. What remains is the grammatical frame of a royal title, the linguistic structure that surrounds a name, without the name itself. The surrounding text describes the deceased as one who knew the Aten in its rising and its setting, who carried the light between worlds, and who was not separated from the disk even in the hour of stillness. That phrase, even in the hour of stillness, is unusual. Hours in Egyptian religious texts are almost always mapped to stages of the solar journey. The rising, the zenith, the setting, the passage through the underworld, the rebirth. The hour of stillness does not appear in the standard liturgical catalog. Some scholars have read it as a scribal variant. One, whose work circulated in manuscript form among Amarna specialists in the 1990s before being largely passed over, suggested it referred specifically to the moment of death, not as a termination, but as a holding, a state between states. The soul neither departed nor present, waiting for something, waiting for the Aten to return. If that reading holds, and it remains contested, the cuneiform, forgive the crossing of traditions, the hieroglyphic context is ambiguous enough that certainty is impossible. Then what was written in that wall was not a prayer for the dead. It was a record of someone who was expected to return. Imagine the Valley of the Kings at the edge of dusk. The cliffs are the color of bone. The shadows that fill the canyon are absolute, not gradual, not graded, but sudden, as if the light simply decides to leave. In the silence that follows the tourist hours, when the sound of generators and voices has receded, you can hear the wind move through the gorge with a quality that is not quite like wind anywhere else. Below the surface, in chambers cut into living limestone, things have waited. Not metaphorically, physically. Painted walls, sealed jars, linen wrappings, inscriptions carved by hands that believed the words would matter for eternity. Somewhere in this valley, or in the cliffs above Amarna, 500 kilometers to the north, a woman who may have been Egypt's most powerful queen during one of its most radical experiments in theology was buried with texts that someone, at some point, decided the world should never read again. She was the most powerful woman in Egypt. She vanished in the 12th year of her husband's reign. No confirmed mummy, no named tomb, no cause of death. History calls this a gap. The hieroglyphs call it something else entirely. Whether that chamber has been found, or whether it waits still beneath plaster and sand and the accumulated certainty of what we think we already know, that question has not been answered. What has been answered is that the erasure was deliberate, that names were changed, that doorways were sealed, that a radar survey produced anomalies that a second survey could not confirm, in circumstances that have never been fully explained. Here is the thing the evidence forces you to consider. The post-Amarna administration, the officials and priests who dismantled Akhenaten's revolution, restored the traditional gods, and systematically erased the names of the heretic Pharaoh and his family from every monument they could reach, did not destroy randomly. They were methodical. They had scribes who understood which texts carried which theological weight. They would have known exactly what was in Nefertiti's burial, and they would have had a choice: destroy it outright or seal it in a way that preserved the physical material while ensuring it could never be read, never be spoken, never be used as a foundation for a religious revival. Sealing is not the same as destroying. Sealing is a decision made by someone who believes the contents might still have power, and who isn't entirely sure the power can be safely destroyed. That distinction matters, not as proof. Nothing here constitutes proof, but as a question that the evidence genuinely forces. Why seal what you could simply burn? Nefertiti's face has stared out from museum cases and magazine covers for a century. We have made her iconic in the way we make things iconic, when we have decided they are beautiful and mysterious and safely distant. But the inscriptions she left behind, the ones that survived erasure, the ones still partially readable in damaged plaster, describe a woman who believed she stood at the center of a theological revolution that would outlast the stone it was carved into. She was wrong about the revolution lasting. The Ammonius priesthood returned. The old gods returned. The Aten was relegated to the status of a failed experiment. But the texts encoded in the walls of Amarna, and possibly in a sealed chamber below the Valley of the Kings, were not entirely erased. They were hidden, preserved in the only way that dangerous knowledge is ever preserved, by being buried deep enough that the people who feared it believed it was gone. 3,300 years later, radar equipment detected anomalies in a wall. An argument began. A second survey was commissioned. Results were disputed. Access was restricted. Official statements were careful, measured, non-committal. And the wall, for now, remains a wall. Subscribe if you want to follow what the ancient record actually contains, the passages that were cut, the names that were changed, and the chambers that may still be waiting. Because the archive is not closed. It has simply been sealed. And sealed things in Egypt were never sealed forever.